Hello, Jivos, and today we're going to be talking about the impossibility of fulfilling desire is the possibility of intrinsic motivation. How what seems like a curse makes possible always having something to do, self-forgetfulness, and a new grounding for social life. This paper is going to be talking about the problem that comes up, say, in Lacan and many thinkers on how desire cannot complete itself. If you get the object of your desire, it turns out not to be the object, or it's not fulfilling. And you always have this sort of dissatisfaction that operates. Lacan will talk about the objet, which is just the idea that desire cannot ever find what it is looking for. And the point I would like to make in this piece is that the very fact that desire cannot fulfill itself in an object is precisely why desire is capable of always being a source of motivation, because it cannot ever die. Well, there is a sense in which we can kill desire by constantly confusing it with objects. We tend to think that desire is a thing, like I desire a boat, for example, as opposed to treat desire as something that is inside of us. So we tend to externalize desire, and funny enough, when we do that, we can kill desire, and that is when boredom happens, because boredom is not where you have nothing to do, but it is a state where you don't see significance in what you could do. So we certainly can kill desire, but what we end up doing when we do that is we don't treat desire like what it actually, I think, is, which is the source of human motivation. What we need to do is think about desire as intrinsic, as something we have, just like hunger. You can never get rid of hunger unless you are dead, and likewise, you can never get rid of desire unless you stop acting in the world and stop moving and stop being motivated. But you see, when we confuse desire with objects, as opposed to seeing it as something in us that makes action possible, then we don't see the necessary role of desire to make us have motivation. In fact, we see, what we do is see desire as something created by our environment that then tortures us, right? Because our environment creates desires and then we can never fulfill them, so we feel like we're in a prison. This is why I think making the source of desire something external and in the object world is very problematic. I think there's this distinction between desire and drives that you'll see throughout society. Now, when I talk about desire and drive in society, I think most of the time desire are like things you want, where drives are more like biological needs, like, sex, hunger, water, stuff like that. And so there's a distinction between these things. The point I would like to make is that I actually think desire is a drive, as in one of the things that the body creates, or that like a need of the body is desire. We need desire because we need motivation. We need something that pushes us forward and to do things, because if we don't act, we die. What happens is, because humans have minds, their desire becomes very distinct from, say, like just merely negative desires, like the desire to not be hungry, or the desire not to be alone. We start desiring things we can imagine, or abstract and symbolic things that aren't found in the natural world. And so desire can come to seem to be something distinct from biological needs and biological drives, precisely because of the capability of humans to abstractly reason. But you see, there's a few things here then. That would mean the distinction between need and desire emerges out of need, you see. It emerges out of, say, the biological vector, if we use Mr. Alung and Bard's language, and becomes seemingly distinct because of the emergence of mind. So then you get this distinction between desire and mind. And then you get this kind of language of drive that kind of blurs desire and need, and all of these things start to blur together. But if we understand that desire emerges out of need, then we can start bringing together desire and need. And I think this is very important, because if we start to see desire as what drives us, well, then it becomes not something you overcome, but something you manage, and that's something you need. And so the very fact then that desire never goes away when we obtain objects of desire is not inherently a bad thing, and in fact, it's a necessary condition for us to survive. And indeed, I think we see today what happens when people don't have desire. It's the quote unquote meaning crisis, the mental health crisis, it's the boredom. So we don't want to get rid of desire. We want to learn to cultivate desire so that it always stays alive and active. Now, everything I just said starts to approach Lacan. But as I understand Lacan, I think for Lacan, there is a distinction between desire and drive. Because drive is what emerges because we are driven by the frustration of desire. Okay, so desire can never get the AGA, and therefore we are driven by that failure. So we're kind of driven by a failure of desire. So there is a distinction, as I can tell, between Lacan, between desire and drive. Now, what I would like to suggest. Oh, and I should note to all of this, desire is always a problem for society. That's why you have economics, that's why you have capitalism, that's why you have, the Girard, right? And that entire theory is a way to manage desire. So this entire piece is in the context of how do we manage the problem of desire, because desire is a problem. And it seems very natural for us to think of desire as created by external circumstances. And that's what I'm arguing is probably problematic. Well, it is problematic because desire is something more akin to a necessity for us to live and to act in the world. But anyway, to return to Lacan. So for Lacan, drive is a result of the frustrations of desire, as I understand it. Now, I'm not a Lacan expert, but so this is just how I take it. Now, what I would say is I wonder if Lacan's analysis of drive, and do note that drive then constructs the subject, it constructs us. I wonder if that's really a very accurate description of adults, but I'm not sure if it is necessary that all subjects arise out of a frustration of desires, because I think we see in children a way of life in which drive and desire are actually very unified and together. If children want a fort, they create one, they make it, they desire it, and they're driven to go to a fort, so they decide that chairs with blankets over them is a fort. Now, when adults look at that, we say, no, that's not a fort, because we imagine the fort on TV and we compare the blanket over the chairs with that and say it's not a fort, and therefore we set ourselves up for a frustration. But when children do it, they say that is a fort, and so it is, and so their desire is not frustrated, and in fact, their subject is created. Their subject is constructed by this creative act, by this ability to create a place in which desire and drive are one and united. I call this intrinsic motivation. This is a product of intrinsic motivation. They are motivated by their desire to have a fort. They create a fort, or they put blankets over chairs and decide that this is a fort. And so here we see in the child not the separation between the real, imagined, and symbolic, but in fact in the creation of a fort, those three registers come together. So when Lacan describes the adult, the adult is using the imaginary basically to escape the real and to convince themselves is equal to the real. And then the symbolic order is the what emerges between people in different different registers of imagination trying to interact and all avoid the real together. So you have this structure, this triad of frustration and avoidance, right? And I think that tends to indeed be how the subject of the adult is constructed and carries his or herself after socialization, because socialization tends to be a process in which we associate desire with things external to ourselves. We are socialized to desire college, marriage, children, money, all these things. And so socialization tends to place our thinking about desire external from ourselves. Whereas with children who have not been socialized so much yet, desire and drive are things inside of you that then you create. They organize your creativity and what you create, as opposed to be some sort of divide you have to cross. And here, there's a way in which, the adult is socialized to think in terms of Kant, that there's a noumenon you cannot cross, that there's, an object of your desire you can never reach. Where for children, there's no noumenon to cross because they are the noumenon. Children are the noumenon. They are the thing in of itself. Desire for children, when it's intrinsically motivated, it's a self-turning wheel Nietzsche talks about. That means desire is desire. And so children, the motivation we see in children is a thing in itself per se. And the children are that thing in of itself, creating what exactly is the expression of that thing in itself. And so I think we see when we start, Kant's mistake is to place the thing in itself in objects, I believe. Whereas we can place, not necessarily, but if you're trained, if you're the child, then you can make the thing of itself intrinsic motivation. Motivation can be the thing in itself. But this is not natural, because we are naturally socialized for motivation to be external and extrinsic. Whereas it takes a lot of work to make it intrinsic and self-feeding. Now, indeed, socialization is necessary because children are intrinsically motivated, but it's almost chaotic because it's not socialized at all, and it can be anachronistic and very problematic, and you can't interact with others, and you couldn't have Hegel's I as other or becoming other if you have a raw intrinsic motivation. So one has to go through socialization to learn how to have that intrinsic motivation not just be isolationism in one's own created universe, but it seems very, very difficult to go through that socialization, move out of childishness into adulthood, and not get lost in that adulthood, which then indeed you construct the subject in terms of Lacan and frustrated desire. The next move is to go into childlikeness, which is socialized intrinsic motivation or socialized desire / drive. And you'll see in the paper where we talk about the difference between desire and drive, which is Lacan, and desire / drive, which is more of this Nietzschean childlikeness and intrinsic motivation. And you see intrinsic motivation here it has a lot of economic and productive consequences, because if people are intrinsically motivated, they're not going to be consuming all the time. They're not going to be causing the meta crisis, as Schleiermacher and all these people talk about, but they're still going to be productive because they're going to be motivated. And really what we see here is a conception, an idea that desire as drive in of itself is about desire learning to find its fittedness in desiring, in being its own self-mover, in moving itself. Now, it's going to use the external world and external material. Children use chairs, they use blankets, but it's not dependent on the external world for its motivation and its action. Furthermore, we move from a desire that's trying to gain something. Instead, we're going to, an intrinsic motivation is a desire of which isn't trying to gain something, but to be itself. It's trying to motivate itself. It's trying to be its own means and end. And that, so, the failure of desire, which drives us, is a result of not seeing desire as what is driving us. Just like hunger and sex and these things, they are driving forces. Desire is a driving force. And if you got rid of food, if you got rid of hunger, so let's say you got rid of hunger. Well, if you got rid of it, then humans wouldn't get energy and they would die, right? Let's say you got rid of sex. Well, if you got rid of sex, then there would be no reproduction, there would be no natural selection, and no socialization. So those things would go away. Very often when we talk about getting rid of hunger, what we think actually is feeding everyone. But that's not getting rid of hunger, that's addressing hunger. Getting rid of hunger would kill us. Likewise, because there'd be no energy. Getting rid of sex would mean humans were all isolated, and it seems to be the case that humans, when they're isolated, perish and die. They certainly don't develop language, and so we would lose mind, and there'd be negative consequences to that. So getting rid of sex would be terrible. Likewise, getting rid of desire would be terrible because we wouldn't have action. I kind of associate desire drive here with chemistry. Biology is sex, food is physics, energy, and desire and drive are chemistry, I think, because it's like a chemical reaction that gets a process started. Now, of course, biology includes physics and chemistry includes physics, and physics is more fundamental. So there's overlap here, of course, but if we think of desire and drive as necessary for getting things moving or causing chemical reactions, then to get rid of desire is to basically finish us off. But then that means we have to somehow approach and use desire to where it doesn't confuse itself with objects of desires, but instead is its own grounding and source. And this is intrinsic motivation. This is when desire ceases to seek fulfillment, but instead seeks fittedness. And you see, the very fact that desire cannot finish itself off is why intrinsic motivation is possible, because intrinsic motivation is motivation that never ends. It goes on and on and on. It's continual action. And so if we start to realize that desire must be a thing that can never be fulfilled, in order for us to have a desire that never ends, for us to always have action and to escape boredom, then the very quote-unquote failures of desire are a blessing. For those are what make possible a life of intrinsic motivation. If it's true that intrinsic motivation gives rise to creativity and purpose, then this failure of desire is precisely what can make us create a better world. And if creativity, like Deirdre McCloskey says, is really what creates the modern world, makes it so rich and prosperous, and also tends to be where humans find purpose, then negating and sublating the failure of desire into the possibility of intrinsic motivation is quite hopeful, and I believe it has a lot of socio-economic and political ramifications, as does self-forgetfulness, that I believe aligns with this, because as the child forgets themselves, and the fact that they don't know how to make a fort, they're not an engineer, well, they forget that, they're not thinking about that, because this is a fort, so there's self-forgetfulness here, and as I think negating and sublating desire into intrinsic motivation and self-forgetfulness have significant political and socioeconomic consequences. I think that putting those together can be a very big step. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, and thank you so much for your time.